Welcome back. And we now finally come to the formation of Athenian democracy. And this is the period in which we have a major change in Athenian government that is going to have far-reaching ramifications for the next 2 centuries, not only in Athenian history, but in general Greek history. I've given you this critical year, 508 BC. This is in fact the foundation of Athenian democracy. And in fact, there have been efforts in recent years sometimes to celebrate landmark dates for the foundation of democracy based on this particular year, 508 BC. It is, of course, important to realize, though, that democracy did not really mean the same thing back then as it means today. You'll see this described to you in your World of Athens textbook. Democracy means literally the power vested in the people, the demos of Athens. And the demos really consists of principally men over the age of registration, male citizens, in other words, not visitors, not women, not slaves, not children. And as such, therefore, really means that only a relatively small proportion of the entire Athenian population is going to be able to serve in any form in government, either as an official of the city or as a member of the Athenian assembly. Nonetheless, though, it was a big step forward for the Athenians to have any kind of population representation in government. Certainly that was quite different from any tyranny or any monarchy or any oligarchy that we would see, for instance, in Sparta, Thebes, Argos, Corinth, most of the other cities, most of which did not, in fact, embrace democratic forms of government. So now let's explain how we actually got there. So on the previous video, you remember that the previous tyrant, Hippias, had been tossed out of the city 511 BC. There were now efforts made to rearrange the government of Athens. And there were, in fact, 2 rival factions. One was a popular faction, trying to represent the people, that was run by Cleisthenes. The other was a faction run by a political rival of Cleisthenes. His name was Isagoras. I will give that to you. Now, Isagoras was supported by a Spartan faction inside Athens that was representing the interests of the Spartan king, whose name was Cleomenes. So, just to put that together so that you're clear, we have Cleisthenes, who was the popular leader in Athens. We have Isagoras, who is a much more conservative aristocratic leader. And then we have Cleomenes, the Spartan king, who supports Isagoras. So, in the wake of the expulsion of Hippias and the termination of the Pisistrated tyranny, we now have this civil war that breaks up briefly between these 2 factions of Cleisthenes and Isagoras. Initially, Cleisthenes was in control. Then the Spartans came in and established Isagoras in control. However, after this was in 510, going down into 509 and 508 BC. However, with some very persistent, determined organization by Cleisthenes, the populace eventually turned against the rule by Isagoras and finally called upon Isagoras to relinquish his power, for the Spartans to get him out, essentially, and for Cleisthenes to be reinstated. Eventually, with enough popular push, I suspect with some maybe appropriate weapons involved, that mob was able to finally force the abdication of Isagoras. The Spartans were compelled to remove themselves from Athens and to finally turn the government, quite reluctantly, over to Cleisthenes. The failure of the Spartans to exert this influence over the Athenians is going to have profound ramifications for the 5th and 4th centuries BC, and incidentally will have an indirect role in the formation of Old Comedy as we understand it with Athens. All right, so now Cleisthenes is finally in control. He doesn't even have a particular position, although he could be termed loosely to be the equivalent of an archon. But in fact, he's just simply the leader of Athens at this point, because the entire government of Athens is essentially in disarray. So Cleisthenes has the opportunity to redo the Athenian government, and this is where the democracy comes from. In a sense, we saw with Solon previously. I'll write some names up here. We saw with Solon, the Archon from 594 BC, the beginnings of what could be thought of as a kind of democratic form of government, even though Archons were still formally in control. What Solon did there was to establish the property classes and to designate who was eligible for high office and who was not. That was to lay the beginning of what would become the democracy. However, what Solon did was to establish particular institutions in the government that would run certain portions of the city. The most notable that becomes important in later Athenian politics is called the Areopagus Council. Areopagus means the hill of Mars, or Ares, of course, the Greek name. And it's the place where military training was done. It's a little bit west of the city of Athens itself. But it also has the high court. And this was established by Solon as the main jury court for the Athenians. And most trials would be carried out there. So what Cleisthenes did was to reorganize the government to maintain the institutions that Solon had put in, including the Areopagus Council. But what he changed was to essentially replace the 4 property classes, even though they were still technically in place, with a whole new system of citizen enrollment involving 10 tribes that would essentially be counted for all of the citizens, not only in Athens itself, but also Attica all around. Those 10 tribes themselves were divided into thirds. So you have what are called tritues, which are each a third of the tribe. So you have 30 tritues altogether. These 10 tribes would have several important responsibilities. First of all, they would elect 10 generals each year. The 10 generals, or strategoi in Greek, were responsible for both military command and also political policy to be presented to the Athenian assembly. The Athenian assembly itself, or the ecclesia, would consist of the enrolled Athenian citizens. Again, we're talking about men over the age of 18, and that's about it. Anybody who is in fact a full Athenian citizen could participate in the assembly and hear legislation put forward to them by the generals or anybody else who wished to speak to the assembly, and then the assembly could vote. In order to ensure that the legislation was appropriate to be presented, there was a boule, B-O-U-L-E, boule, which was a special council to investigate the legislation before it was turned over to the assembly for a vote. So you have now these 10 tribes who elect generals. The 10 tribes also send representatives to the assembly, and one of the 10 tribes for a tenth of the year is referred to as the Prytany tribe. P-R-Y-T-A-N-Y. The Prytany tribe is the one that runs the assembly for 1/10 of the year, and one person is elected by lot to chair the meeting from that Prytany tribe. So this way, now we have much more popular support within the Athenian government itself. The Athenians, as such, are therefore now responsible as a demos for most areas of Athenian policy, and again can hear legislation presented to them by speakers and then carry out the appropriate votes. And again, it often would be the 10 generals who would be most prominent in rhetorically presenting arguments to the Athenian populace for why a policy should be this or that, what kind of decisions to be made. And so the generals had to be skilled rhetoricians as well as skilled military commanders. So that is the essence of the new government that is put in place by Cleisthenes in 508 BC. Now, about 50 years later, there's a major change that happens in this government, and that is initiated by Pericles. This is after the Persian Wars that we're going to discuss in the next video. Pericles is essentially the most powerful leading politician in Athens after a time. And Pericles believed very strongly that the Athenians should have as close to supreme power in the Aegean Sea as possible, and in particular should not in any way have to be subordinate or inferior or in any way responsible to or accountable to other polis of the Greek world, especially the Spartans, whom Pericles appears to have disliked quite intently. So the Athenians and Spartans had an alliance for a time after the conclusion of the Persian Wars, because both the Athens and Sparta were instrumental in defeating the Persians. However, that broke down as differences in philosophy between the Spartans and the Athenians over governmental setup and other differences ended up really moving them apart. And eventually there was an incident in which the Spartans called for the Athenians to help out in an emergency and then ended up sending them home again. At that point, Pericles, who had wanted really the Cleisthenes government to be modified to be much more radical so that the population was in control, teamed up with an otherwise unknown figure to us, Ephialtes, to change the government to now put all of the responsibility of the government now directly on the populace. In particular, this council, the Areopagus Council, was stripped of its jury court powers, except for a couple of high trial positions, such as trials of homicide or religious crimes or any other really important special case that needed to be heard. Otherwise, we now have what are called the Heliae courts, which are general populace jury courts. These are the ones that are going to be satirized, you'll see in Aristophanes' Wasps. So Pericles essentially changes the government amount so that now the population makes all of the decisions. And as such, it means that if they hear a policy presented to them by a leader of the city, that if they vote on it, that there's really no check on their power. So one has to hope that the policy that's being put forward that they like a lot, if they happen to like the speaker, is really the right one for the Athenian polis to follow. As you will see eventually, that's not always the case. So democracy was quite a fascinating institution to establish in Athens, and probably was a distinct improvement over the forms of government that had been situated in Athens before. But it did have its weaknesses. In essence, the position that we see now becoming eventually a plague on the Athenian democracy is this. The demagogue. The demagogue is supposed to be a leader of the people, but the name had a similar connotation to what it has today. It really means somebody who is going to lead the people essentially for his own interests. So a demagogue is somebody who can get up in front of the assembly and can probably on multiple occasions, call for the populace to make certain policy decisions that probably in many cases were really not in the best interest of the city of Athens as a whole. So Pericles, in fact, is really the one who shows how demagoguery can work. And although many of his decisions did have enormous benefits for the Athenians, to be sure, there was a sense that he was effectively pushing the Athenian democracy in particular directions that were really to his liking and not necessarily to the general city's liking, and that in fact some of those policy decisions upon retrospect in fact were mistaken ones that the Athenians would likely came to regret in much later days. So that's the danger of this kind of radical democracy, is that there is no check on the power of the demos. And it was probably for this, among other reasons, that made later philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, suspicious of democracy as a whole. Even though they certainly didn't like tyranny, they weren't entirely sure that democracy was so great either, because the idea of mob rule, the mob basically ruling everything, filled a lot of political thinkers with apprehension of what that might eventually lead to. Okay, so that's the formation of democracy, and in our next video we will see the major challenge that comes to the Athenian democracy from the Persians as we discuss the Persian War period, an extraordinarily a vital one for Athenian history. We will see you shortly in the next video.